Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started. It's a couple of minutes after the appointed time, and welcome very much to everyone who's joined us for this VLGA Connect Live panel session about the upcoming elections in October and the new electoral regulations that have been released. Before we commence, could I please acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands across the state and possibly beyond from which you all join us this afternoon, and we pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. Great to see you all. I would like to introduce you to our panellists for today's discussions. Firstly, the CEO of the VLGA, Kathryn Arndy, is with us, as Kathryn always is through our panel sessions. Hi, Kathryn. This is a particularly important one for the VLGA and your members.
Certainly is, Chris. As everyone would be aware, the local government elections are scheduled for the 24th of October. The electoral regulations that have been developed to support that process are now available. So today's conversation is critically important so that we can hear from, I guess, those key sector leaders and agencies who will be responsible for overseeing that process. And I do welcome all of our panellists, and of course, Chris, thank you for your moderation of today's discussion.
Thank you, Kathryn. Before we do get into the panel, it's probably worth just noting there's some uncertainty around at the moment with changing conditions due to COVID-19. I know you're watching developments very closely. Is there anything you'd like to say at the outset about your understanding right now?
Absolutely. We're in regular contact with Local Government Victoria and also the Minister's Office. So the campaigning guidelines that were released on Friday, which a lot of potential candidates were waiting for, are currently being reviewed against the recently introduced stage 4 restrictions, just to see if they need to be updated. And they will be then, I guess, released again probably in the next day or so if there is any changes to those. In addition, we're certainly being advised as late as yesterday that the local government elections are proceeding, and therefore we're really working on that basis and hope to just provide clear and consistent messaging and guidance to the sector.
Thank you, Kathryn, because I'm sure we would have had some questions about that if we didn't deal with that at the outset. So can I please now introduce our panellists, and we'll get into some discussion with them. Firstly, terrific to have the Victorian Electoral Commissioner, Warwick Gately, AM, with us. Good afternoon, Warwick, and welcome to you. I won't ask you to respond just yet. I'll do the introductions. We've got Councillor Sandra Wilson, who is the Deputy Mayor at Hobsons Bay City Council and a two-term mayor during her 2 terms on council, if that makes sense. John Lynch is with us. I hope we're having some technical difficulties, but I think John has managed to reconnect. He's the Acting Chief Municipal Inspector with the Local Government Inspectorate. Ross Millard is also here from the Inspectorate to support John in today's discussion. And terrific to have Tony Raunic from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, Managing Principal, who will provide us with some guidance along the way in terms of interpretation of regulations and legislation, etc. So with that very expert panel ready to go and to take your questions, I do note that some questions have been submitted in advance, which we've made a note of. If you do have questions during the discussion today, please use the chat function, the chat window in Zoom. They will, if history tells us anything, they will build up pretty quickly. So we do have VLGA people monitoring those, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can during the course of our discussion this afternoon. The other note is to please stay on mute until such time as Kathryn might call on you to ask a question or make a comment. So firstly, Warwick, if I can come to you as the Victorian Electoral Commissioner, really pleased that you've made some time to be with us today. Thank you. I'm curious, particularly in light of Kathryn's comment, you'll need to come off mute there too, please, Warwick. In light of Kathryn's comments there, how's the VEC monitoring the conditions that are ever changing at the moment, and what impacts is that having on your election planning?
Many thanks, Chris, and it is good to be here. And I'll respond to that question from Kathryn, and I'll make the point straight up front that the VEC is proceeding on the expectation that these elections will continue as scheduled on the 24th of October. So make no doubt about that. So all our work is proceeding to that end, and we've started a number of public advertising messages as well, statutory ads, etc. So that it's business as usual here with regard to that election date. I think, like a lot of other agencies and departments and businesses, we are monitoring continually where this is proceeding, and we're adjusting all our plans accordingly, and they are being adjusted almost daily in response. We grappled with the stage 3 restrictions, and we moved a lot of the services online. We made adjustments to our election office locations, our election office sizes. We adjusted our counting venues as well to satisfy social distancing requirements and also to meet occupancy limits. And of course, under stage 3, that was going to slow things down. We've now gone to stage 4. I'm looking very carefully at stage 4 and what the exact implications are, not only for the VEC, but we are very heavily reliant upon other providers. For example, Australia Post critical in this postal election. We've got mail houses, we've got printers, we've got couriers, we've got logistics companies. We're working very closely with them to find out the implications of certainly stage 4 on their operations and what that means for the elections ultimately. And we'll get a better handle on that over the next few days. I think in terms of general communications, importantly, we've got a strong service plan, and that's been published as well. We're about to publish a COVID-safe election plan, which will overlay the service plan, and that will go to specific details in relation to various election activities as well. The website will be a critical source of information, and given that the elections have a very local focus, we'll be doing candidate bulletins. They'll be distributed by the election manager in each of the elections as well. So they're the prime sources of information. We're watching continuously, we're adjusting continuously, we're looking at the implications, and we'll be communicating via a wide variety of sources. I think that's probably pretty much on that one, Chris.
Thanks, Warwick. So that COVID-safe plan is interesting. I'm wondering how that intersects with your candidate handbook. Do you see that as being almost a living document at the moment as things change as well? Because people do see that as the Bible, I guess, for campaigning.
Look, absolutely. And the candidate handbook, of course, is critical to this. And that's issued, that's on the website as well. So I'd encourage all candidates to look at that. We will come out with further information in relation to all these steps. So, for example, nominations, counting, scrutineering, declaration, that will all be provided in due course as things become clearer and we adjust our operations.
Yes. Okay, terrific. Thank you, Warwick. I want to move on to John Lynch, the Acting Chief Municipal Inspector. Thank you, John, very much for joining us. The Inspectorate, of course, an important role in the integrity regime for local government. Just interested to hear you talk a little bit about your planning for the election and the approach that you'll be taking, and I guess what you'll be looking for in terms of where your focus will be, John.
Well, look, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session. The Inspectorate, for those of you who don't know, is currently established under the 1989 Act and will be re-established under the new Act when it comes into operation. So our focus and planning is really built around our current functions and powers, which I think in the context of the election will probably have 3 main focuses. One will be to investigate and prosecute possible offences under the Local Government Act. Secondly, to examine breaches of the Act itself. And thirdly, to investigate public interest complaints involving councillors and senior council staff. Those of you who are familiar with the Inspectorate may also be aware that we can investigate allegations of councillor misconduct for the purposes of a councillor conduct panel or VCAT, but I don't think that'll be an issue for the elections themselves. So yeah, it'll be those 3 things. It'll be offences, it'll be breaches, it'll be public interest disclosures.
So just on that last point, there is a new piece of legislation around public interest disclosures. What sort of impact or change has that had on perhaps the way you'll be approaching dealing with complaints in the past?
Look, I think it's got the potential to be quite an interesting development for this election. It's the first time that whistleblowers will receive the enhanced protections that came with the amendments to the Public Interest Disclosure Act at the start of the year. So the Act now establishes a public interest disclosure, or PID, scheme to provide protection for people who make disclosures about improper conduct and corruption within the Victorian public sector. And the sector includes councillors and council staff. So under the new regime, the protections will include things like maintaining or protecting the identity of disclosures and protecting them from reprisals like bullying or harassment or even legal action.
Thanks, John. We'll come back to you because I would like to explore some of that complaint handling element a bit more if we have time. I want to bring Councillor Sandra Wilson into the conversation, Deputy Mayor at Hobsons Bay and a two-term mayor. We wanted to get a perspective from someone who's campaigned a couple of times successfully, and I guess sharing a bit of the learnings that have come along the way. Sandra, can I ask you a really easy one at the outset? What do you know now that you wish you knew back then when you first ran for council?
Thanks, Chris. And I think for anyone, and I can see quite a few experienced councillors in the room, and I think anyone would attest to your first election campaign is a very intense on-the-job learning experience, even if you've had a fair bit of exposure to local government, and I certainly had. I'd attended plenty of council meetings, I was on committees of council, and I asked questions in the chamber, things like that. So, but it is, to go into campaign mode for local government it's quite an intense experience. And what I wished I'd known then that I know now is the amount of support that is available, and you've referred to the Bible being the VEC handbook, and indeed what I call the nuts and bolts of understanding campaigning and how to conduct yourself, all the rules and regulations around the do's and don'ts of campaigning. But there's a whole lot of other support that is available for candidates and indeed councillors who are standing for re-election, which includes the peak bodies like the VLGA is a wonderful support for candidates, and indeed the Australian Local Government Women's Association, for example, but also the level of support that it's a very insular thing and a very local thing when you're standing for campaign, but standing for election in a campaign, but also the amount of support and guidance that can come from others, and that could be other candidates within the municipal boundaries and former councillors and councillors from other municipalities. The support that's available through practical support, not just the nuts and bolts. And so I think there's a lot more support now than there was 8 years ago. That's my sense, and particularly for women. So that's one thing. And I think another thing is the timing and the importance of the ballot packs arriving in letterboxes. I probably went very early and became a de facto VEC employee, explaining boundary ward changes when I went early letterboxing and door knocking, and it probably stood me in good stead. We'd just gone through a ward review, but I went very early, and that critical timing of when the ballot packs arrive is important for candidates to understand the timing of things and how it unfolds.
So what's your best advice for a first-time candidate on the first thing they should be doing or how they start?
I think it's 7 weeks yesterday to the close of nominations at 12 noon on the 22nd of September. So in the constraints of today, with us having time limits in what we can do, is having a very good, strong, effective plan that you're putting into action now. There's going to be your understanding of your candidate statement, your printing of practical things like printing if you are doing letterboxing, where you may have your call flute locations, and getting a good support team around you to help you with identifying some of those opportunities. So I think start now, the planning.
Yes, well, I do make the point in some of the candidate sessions that we've had, a lot of incumbent councillors have announced they are standing again some months ago, and that's effectively the start of their campaign, isn't it? So for the new candidates, you really don't have time to lose. You've got.
And I think that potentially in this climate, incumbents could be favoured. They are known, and the opportunities to be known at the moment as a new candidate are constrained.
Thank you, Sandra. I want to move on to Tony Raunic, who's with us from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Thanks for joining us, Tony. We're looking forward to your insights through the course of the discussion, of course, but one thing we've noticed, even from some of the questions that are coming in, is a continuing lack of confusion or clarity for some people around the responsibility areas. And I know you've done a bit of work to try and simplify that in terms of a responsibility matrix. How do you simply explain who does what in the election period?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris, and just the number of bodies represented today just shows that there is that opportunity for confusion. And when I think back, even my own time as a councillor and a mayor, was who's responsible for what. But look, we've heard from Warwick initially, and of course the VEC are really responsible for conducting the poll itself. So questions around, the nomination of candidates and the approval of candidate statements and the counting of the ballot papers, etc. And often that also drags in complaints about whether candidate documentation has been authorised or not. Where the confusion often, I think, comes in is in real practical elements like where a candidate's signage has been located. We often hear about these corflute signs. Have they been placed on a public reserve, on a roadway? These aren't matters to bring to the VEC. Initially, they're of course still governed by the council itself, so these matters should be brought to the attention of the CEO of the council and dealt with at a council level. Often they're governed by the municipal local law or the local planning scheme. I know we've got a number of governance officers, I think, who are participating in this webinar. There's a responsibility on the CEO in relation to authorising council press releases and material, of course. And then many of these other bodies, like the inspectorate, get involved perhaps in relation to more serious offences and matters. So in terms of the conduct of councillors who are running for re-election, again, I'd suggest that might initially be something to be directed to the CEO. We still have the council or code of conduct that applies, and those sanctions under the Local Government Act. Those other bodies can come in if it's seen to fall within their authority. But often there's a role here for the CEO of the council themselves.
So a couple of questions that have come in, Tony, have been around that role of the CEO. At first I was a little bit surprised, but then I remind myself this only happens every 4 years. There's probably people new to the sector in the governance space that haven't been through an election campaign before. We've got a new Local Government Act and a new set of election regulations. So it's understandable, I guess, that people are a bit nervous about, have the rules changed? What do I need to know? How do you advise council governance people and CEOs on how they can be certain they understand their responsibilities?
Yeah, look, there's been some clarification in the new the statute and regulations, but essentially the position hasn't changed. That, of course, during the election period, there are rules in place to really preserve the integrity of the election and to make sure that there's appropriate use of council resources. So as Australians, we all get the notion that we believe in a fair go and we believe that, we should have a fair playing field. And that comes into the council election situation where councils have to be careful, and councillors, particularly who are running for re-election, need to be mindful of the rules around appropriate use of council resources during the election period. So that will come down to the local council's election period policy that they'll have, that will make statements about who will be the spokesperson for council during the election period. Often that will be the CEO, not the mayor and the councillor. So councillors who are running for re-election would need to be mindful when they're speaking during the election period at public events, that they make it clear that they're speaking on their own behalf. Councils themselves will need to be careful to follow their local election period policy in dealing with questions from councillors and requests for use of council resources during that period. And councillors who are running for council need to be very careful about, you know, using, for example, just councillors issued business cards. It wouldn't be appropriate to go door knocking and hand out your council issued business card. It wouldn't be appropriate to, you know, drive around during a door knocking in your council issued motor vehicle with your, you know, A-frame sign on the trailer behind, calling for you to be re-elected. But even little things like wearing, you know, council issued clothing with the council logo on it. You wouldn't want to be doing that in a campaign type environment as a councillor. So I think the starting point for council officers and councillors is that election period policy each council will have. They're generally quite well drafted, and they generally deal with these issues around the use of resources and who is to speak on behalf of council during that critical election period.
And the requirement was to have that in place last October, 12 months out. So it's possible some councils might have forgotten they've already done that, and you just need to dig that out and keep that handy, I guess, as another Bible to guide the next period. I can see questions are coming in, and I'd like to get to those as quickly as possible, but I do want to clarify, and perhaps with Warwick, we've got a lot of discussion going on around the mandatory training. Who it applies to, and the simple answer is everyone who's going to stand, and how that, I guess, Warwick, how the VEC is going to be ensuring that people have completed that training before they can be a candidate.
Thank you, Chris. The mandatory candidate training, you must have completed that within the previous 4 years, and it's a requirement that you have completed that, therefore to qualify as being a candidate. Now, at the point of nomination, you'll make a declaration to the fact that you have completed that training. The training, of course, is delivered and administered by Local Government Victoria, not the VEC. But we will have access to information to confirm that a prospective candidate, at the point of nominating, at the point of declaring that they're qualified to be a councillor, will have completed that training. Now, that's the involvement of the VEC in so much as this mandatory training is concerned. I understand it will be going online. Again, that's a matter for Local Government Victoria. So I'd encourage prospective candidates to make themselves entirely familiar with the requirements of the mandatory training when they make that declaration at the point of nominating.
Yes.
And they need to go onto the LGV website and find out that information and satisfy themselves that they've met that declaratory requirement.
Indeed. So my understanding, Warwick, is that it will be there any minute, possibly even today. There's a responsibility, and Tony might confirm, on councils to ensure that a link to that material is provided on their website, so the assistance provided. And from what I've seen, once you complete the training, it will generate an electronic certificate based on the information you've got to identify yourself, etc. And that's what you would be expected to present to the VEC as proof.
I think, Chris, it's a matter of identifying at what point in time did you access that training.
Yes, yes, okay. That will be really important for next time around too, with that 4-year period, I guess. But of course, you can only do it from today if it's available today onwards for this year.
Indeed, and again, look, also for prospective candidates, get hold of the nomination form and have a look through that as to what the requirements are. It's quite clear there with respect to the mandatory candidate training.
Yeah. And clear also that sitting councillors need to complete that candidate training.
That is correct, unless they have done it at some point in time in the previous 4 years.
Okay. And the other point that often comes up in our workshops is people thinking they can't start their campaign until they've completed that training, and clearly that's not the case either. Correct. Just to make the point clear. So Kathryn, I might come to you and see if we've got any questions from the audience that we might start going to weave into the discussion. How's it looking?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And they're coming in thick and fast. Just to reiterate what Warwick said, clearly no councillor who may be looking at running in this election would have completed that mandatory training because it's not yet available. So I guess just to confirm that every candidate, whether you're a councillor now or you're not, who is looking to run in this election will need to complete that mandatory training, which, as you said, Chris, hopefully will be available on the Local Government Victoria website from today. But as of now, it's not, but anytime soon. A few questions have come through. I'll just scroll back. We've had a question from Sylvia around how you find out if a present councillor is actually running again. Look, there's really no way to know that unless that councillor declares their hand, but certainly as of the time of close of nominations, I believe, and Tony, you might jump in here, that candidates would then be publicly available, but as for knowing beforehand, there's no way of doing that. Jennifer, you had a question. Councillor Jennifer Anderson.
Oh yes, I've actually had a few phone calls from sitting councillors who are in their first term, because I'm in my second term, and I honestly can't remember how I dealt with it 4 years ago. There's that overlap of you're still a currently elected representative and you're representing council, and the decisions of council are what they are, and you don't want to winky pop and all of that. So it's that decision about, a lot of people are starting to email people and say, what's your stance on dogs off lead, or, you know, slashing of grass, etc. And it's getting that fine line between how much do you go out there and say stuff that's your personal opinion versus, well, this is the council decision and this is where it's at. So it's I've had a few people that have asked me that question, and I've kind of gone, I can't remember how I dealt with it 4 years ago. So I think a bit of advice on that might be helpful.
Yeah, so this, good question, Jennifer. So this is all about the preconceived bias type issue, and of course candidates for council, including existing councillors, want to be careful that, you know, they're not placing themselves in a position that at the point of having to make the decision, when they're hearing submissions from the public, potentially in the gallery or written submissions, that they haven't already at a previous moment put themselves in a position where they've said, this is how I'm going to vote on that issue. So questions about, you know, what's your attitude to more parkland, and what's your attitude to generally the medium density housing proliferating in the suburb. I think you can certainly express general opinions about that, but about a specific issue that is like, say, a planning issue, what's your opinion, councillor, about the application for 40 units on Main Road, or candidate, what's your opinion on that? The sort of language I think you need to use is to show that you still have an open mind. So you might have a strong view that you want to put across, and it might be, well, you know, I've got a strong view that we really need to be aware of community concerns about medium density housing. And if I'm elected as a councillor, then I'll certainly be expressing that view strongly in the chamber, and, you know, applying that view when I think about my position on various planning matters, including the one you've just nominated to me. It's because the last thing you'd want to do as a councillor or a candidate for council in that situation is to find yourself prevented from actually having a vote when you get elected on a matter that you really care about, because you've made this statement that suggests that you have a closed mind to potentially the arguments that the applicant might put, or indeed objectors might put in the matter. But it really tends to apply to specific decisions that are either a statutory planning decision, or a more strategic decision about rezoning or sale of some land or purchase of some land. They're the sort of decisions that the public often have an opportunity to put their view forward formally to council, and you want to be seen as continuing to have an open mind, as you should, to the opportunity to read those submissions and hear them before you finally make a determination as to how you'll vote.
The aim is to avoid winky popping yourself, as we say, Tony, which is not, I might bring John in here, as I understand it's not in the Local Government Act, but it is a matter of law, because the winky pop decision was a Supreme Court decision. John, in terms of the complaints that you deal with typically in election campaign, has that started to come through in any of the issues you're required to monitor, that issue of preconceived bias?
Look, I must say that I'm not aware of any coming through at this stage, Chris. But Ross, I don't think that the flow of complaints has actually started.
No, I sort of meant in previous election campaigns, etc. Or is it still a new phenomenon? There's just this issue of the predetermined view and the open mind.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it being an issue previously, but Ross may have a bit more insight.
Yeah, we have had complaints about it, Chris. You know, our viewers, it's a civil matter, apprehended bias.
Yeah.
So we don't get a lot, but we have had a few come to us that probably, like, we'd view it as a civil matter.
Okay. So, John, while I've got you there, in terms of complaints generally, what are the high risk areas from your point of view that campaigners need to be aware of to avoid, I guess, running afoul of the system?
Well, look, I think probably the biggest risk for candidates is really just not having that comprehensive understanding of their obligations under Part 8 of the new Act. I think it's essential that candidates are aware of the types of expectations regarding their behaviour that the new legislation puts on them. And look, just to give you some sort of perspective around that, the new Act creates 16 summary and 6 indictable offences specifically related to the conduct of local government elections, and they range in seriousness from quite serious indictable offences, so like forging and tampering with ballot papers, through to the kinds of election-related behaviour that probably some of you are aware of, like nominating when you're not entitled to, or not having your authorised election material sorted out properly.
Mm.
So, yeah, look, you've just got to be aware of what those obligations are.
Thanks, John. Kathryn?
Councillor Suzanne, you had a question which perhaps relates to this conversation that we're having now.
Thanks, Kathryn. Yeah, so we've had a party say something completely false about a decision that we've made, and it's gone out in flyers, and I've put a post up on my Facebook page about it, correcting it. But is there anything that we can do about that? It's just completely false.
Okay, who'd like to tackle that one? Have you got a view, Tony, from a legal standpoint?
There has actually been a case, Suzanne, and I'm trying to remember which council it was, but there was a case where a CEO felt the need to come out and issue a press release at the time to issue some clarification. And so what I've got to say, like, in any situation like that, you'd want to have the specific facts to give some really direct advice to the CEO about what was appropriate to say, potentially in a press release that was perhaps a clarifying press release. But certainly councils have in the past taken the position that something's out there that is that is misleading the community, and there's a lot of community angst about that, and they want to issue a clarification. But of course, there is it is a short election period, and there's an opportunity for things to be said post the election. And I think CEOs are often mindful that, that there could potentially be a new council elected that has a very different view to the present, policy positions that are agreed at the council. So, look, the main thing is for the CEO and administration of council not to be seen to be getting into the political arena and favouring a particular candidate or not. So any statement that was issued that was clarifying would need to really be about the issue rather than be naming candidates.
Yes, we've got a couple of questions in regard to social media. Perhaps we'll go to Tony DeFazio in the first instance. Tony, you had a question for the Inspectorate.
Yeah, I was intrigued to read the Inspectorate Bulletin the other day where it showed the themes in regard to complaints coming out of the last couple of elections, and social media seems to be at the forefront, and I think continues to be an issue which candidates and officers that trying to grapple with our social media policy and guidelines. Just wondering, John and Ross, whether having considered that, whether you'd be putting out any guidelines to the sector or to candidates in regard to do's and don'ts as a form of guidance.
That's a really, really good question, Tony. I know that in the 2016 election, social media was becoming more of an issue and a source of complaint. And I think that we're going to see that ramp up even more in this year's election. A question of whether look, I must say, I don't think we've really turned our mind to the question of whether we should be providing guidance to the sector on how to deal with social media. But I think it's a very, very good point, and one that I'll certainly take on board and take back to the office. So yeah, thanks for that.
Chris Warwick, I'll come in here if I can very quickly.
Please.
The candidate handbook does go to that matter, and I guess there's two elements to it. One, you must satisfy the terms and conditions of the relevant platform. And the second part of that is that it must carry, your social media commentary must carry or directly linked to an authorisation. So the anonymity provision is still applicable in that regard.
So Warwick, in terms of social media and that link to authorisation, is it sufficient to have, say you're making statements on Twitter or Facebook, for your authorisation to be in the profile area of your social media account? Is that classified as linked?
Yeah, or a link back to a website,
right?
For example.
Okay. While we're on authorisation, there have been a lot of questions in recent weeks from people through the candidate information workshops about what constitutes a proper authorisation. It seems people can be a bit confused about how much they need to say. Is there a model authorisation that people can look at?
Look again, and Tony might want to come in as well. Again, there's information in the candidate handbook in relation to that. There was one question I noted earlier where you can now, for an address, put down a post office box address. You cannot have the address as an email address.
Right. Okay.
So that's a recent change.
And that was one of our submitted questions about the post office box, and it was highlighted as being particularly relevant for female candidates who don't want to put home addresses for obvious reasons on their authorisations. Sandra, I'm conscious we haven't brought you into the conversation for a little while. In terms of that authorisation issue as a councillor, have you found that challenging in the past, and is it something that candidates find to be complex?
I personally haven't found it to be an issue. In the first election, I did use my home address, but not with my name. My husband was authorised me at my home address. In the second election, I had someone who was notable in the community who supported me to authorise all of my materials willingly. So it hasn't been an issue, but I have had the question from a single female candidate who wanted to take advice on that comfort level, and being much comforted that that those other options were available. I think it's pretty clear, candidates, and it's been said a number of times, we have to be aware of all of our obligations under the guidelines, and that's a first and foremost. Be responsible and make yourself aware of all of these issues. I think social media is a tricky one, and if there's an opportunity to have some commentary on that further in before the close, there's a couple of comments I might make in that space, but it's not quite related to authorisations.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to that. Kathryn, time for another question if we have some more.
There's been a few questions that have come in around what is permissible campaigning, and we might, for those who perhaps missed the opening of our conversation today, we did touch on that. The current guidelines that were released on Friday are being reviewed now, and they were certainly applicable and permissible activities in stage 3. So there was a question from regional Victoria around stage 3. And Local Government Victoria are just reviewing those guidelines against stage 4, and we anticipate that if there are any changes to those as they currently stand, they'll be available in the next day or so. So just stay tuned for that. We've had a few questions also relating to whether or not you can hand out your councillor card prior to the 22nd of September if you are rerunning. Now, I'm not sure, Dot, if Tony had answered some of or touched on that for you.
So yeah, that's a really important one, because I've been saying, here's my number, and you know, I don't want to find out that I'm breaking some rules. I'm saying I'm rerunning, but after the 22nd of December, I'm very aware that I can't hand out any council stuff. But prior, is that a problem?
So Dot, it really turns on what you're doing prior to the election period. So to take an extreme view, like if a councillor was using the council letterhead outside the election period and just writing to people saying, you should vote for me, these are all the things I've achieved, they're still using council resources to campaign. So in your example where you, as a councillor, you're out there trying to gauge the views of your community, speak to them, and you're knocking on doors and someone's not there and you're leaving a message to say, this is how you can get hold of me. But really, it's in your role as a councillor and speaking and communicating with your community. I still wouldn't, even outside an election period, be sort of writing campaign-related stuff on your business card that might be, you know, and by the way, you should vote for me, not the other person who says they're going to run, because blah, 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 because you're, you know, if you think of it just from the perspective of, am I placing myself at an unfair disadvantage to other candidates by using this council resource in campaigning, then if that's the case, then you shouldn't use that resource. But if you're simply using it as part of your ongoing role as a councillor, then I think that there's no concern about that.
Thank
Tony,
you. That clarifies what I've been told. So, because I have been told that, you know, you can't hand out your cards and ask them how they're doing in the community and then say, and I am going to be rerunning when they ask you. So, but no, I definitely don't write on any of the things. So I'm glad you've clarified that for me, because let's just say there are other councillors and other people that like to try and tell you what you are and aren't doing right to have that power. So I'm glad that I'm in this meeting. I look forward to the more of what I'm hearing.
Thank you, Councillor. And I see Councillor Sophie Ramsey from Melton, hi Sophie, has just asked the very question I was going to ask you, Tony, and that was a common one for councillors is use of mobile phones. And my observation over the years is councillors have gotten used to carrying 2 phones around, especially come election campaigns, so they can completely separate those duties. Is that good advice?
Yeah, look, I've there's all sorts of practices around this. I know, and I do, you know, election period training for councils and such. And some councillors are in the practice of handing their mobile phone in during the election period. There's no requirement, can I add, that you do that, because your role as a councillor continues right up until election day. But yes, you shouldn't be, you know, for an extreme example might be on your candidate statement saying, and this is how you can get hold of me, and you're a candidate, and using your council phone number there. I wouldn't be doing that. That's clearly using a council resource as part of your campaigning. But I do understand, having been a councillor myself, that you'll still get called during the election period about the pothole and the barking dog.
So that one question really does go back to my use of, my phone has been my phone for 20 years and no one else has ever had that number. And I put that number on my candidate statement, and I also put that number on my core flutes, because I don't mind being out there in the public and letting people know my number. Yours, it's not a council number. They don't own my number. I've had it for 20 years.
Who pays for the phone, Dot?
So what it is I have a contract that is under my name that has the ability to, I can put a claim in every month for the $100 that is under. And I used to have to pay a lot more in my phone bill. So right now, are you saying if I put a claim in for them to pay for that number, they own that number? I'm just trying to get clarification on this, because we've had this discussion at my council as well.
Look, can I just say, you've got a particular practice there where that is perhaps a bit unique and a bit more unusual. I'd suggest that perhaps in hindsight, there might be other ways that might be you know, an easier way to demonstrate that you're not using council resources. But in your case, you might decide that during the election period, you don't put in the claim because you're using that phone predominantly for an election purpose rather than the council law related purpose. And just for that period, you're not claiming against the council purse. That might be a way for you to resolve that issue.
Thanks, Tony. We need to move on. Just in light of that discussion, though, you may have mentioned it, forgive me if you did, but I imagine a lot of that will also turn on your council's election period policy. It could potentially be a bit more strict than the next council. So check it just in case. Would you agree?
Great idea. And as I say, there's a range of approaches that councils take. It's certainly, as I say, some councils, the practice is handing the mobile phones. Others, you know, have a much more nuanced approach to it. So a starting point for any council now is to be asking their governance officers, can you please give me a copy of our election period policy? I want to read that, and maybe we need a briefing as councillors on what it's all about as well prior to the election period.
Tony, curious in your experience, I'm aware of only one, there may be more, of a council that has a pre-election period policy to deal with, and Steve Cooper and I have discussed this on our governance update recently, to deal with that grey area leading up to the election period. So,
yeah, look, often in the conversation councillors have early in their term about, you know, the code of conduct, there might be some sort of agreement that's reached about how we use council resources during the period, how we refer to each other, you know, in our social media, how we operate our own individual social media accounts, and what council, the administration will do with the official council social media pages when comments are made that are negative about councillors or candidates for council. So it is a good area to look at. It's not common for councils necessarily to have this level of detail there, but I think we'll increasingly see that, particularly in the social media space. There's more and more questions come through about, you know, what's appropriate in the social media setting.
Thanks, Tony. Kathryn, I'll come back to you in just a moment for more audience questions. Well, I've got a submitted question from earlier that I want to make sure we deal with, and it's for Warwick Gately from the VEC. Warwick, we were asked about, I think the VEC has been clear with a declaration of poll date of the 13th of November. The question was, is that a hard and fast date for all council results to be declared, or is it possible some would be declared earlier than that?
Chris, look, thank you. That's our target date, the 13th of November. And I'll just alert all participants, that's a week later than we achieved in 2016. And you can understand why. The circumstances at the moment will mean that that our ballot paper processing, our ballot paper counting, given the restrictions imposed upon us, will take us longer. Now, so that is our target date. The responsibility on the election manager is to declare the results publicly as soon as practicable after the results have been finalised. And that ordinarily occurs in about a 2 to 4 hour window post the final counting and the results being identified. And that gives candidates time to look through those results and satisfy themselves as to the rigour in the counting. The election manager would therefore act independently, having proceeded that down that path within his local area. We are not looking to centralise the declaration results from here in Melbourne. They will still be conducted locally. They'll be conducted by the election manager, somehow in situ. We're just working through that at the moment. But look, I would alert everybody that the 13th of November is a target date for the completion of all the declarations. As we get into stage 4, as we come to terms with that, as we come to terms with the candidate numbers and the size of the counting, that may well shift. That may well go beyond the 13th of November. That's my target date. So I would just add that, that for candidates, be aware of that. I won't be rushed into finalising results and doing a declaration when I'm concerned about the integrity of the activity. I'll take my time, I'll do the right thing, I'll count it properly. And the next stage of that, I'd ask councils to be mindful of trying to book in a swearing in ceremony too soon after the declaration of results. Let me get the work done and then give that consideration. But it will take us time. 13th of November, a target date. Some might be before that, some might shift to after that, but they'll be independent.
That's very clear. Thank you, Warwick. And it's exactly that reason I think the question's been asked about councils trying to plan when there's swearing in ceremonies, etc., are going to be occurring. So some patience along the way and understanding will obviously be appreciated and required. Kathryn, back to audience questions if you have some.
Yes, thank you, Chris. We do have a couple of from Councillor Ross Ebbels, from the Mayor of the Borough of Queenscliff. Ross, would you like to ask your question about councillor profile photographs? I think it may have been covered by the election policy applicable to the council, but perhaps... yeah.
Possibly, because obviously, and particularly since I became mayor, I did have a photo shoot, and to be honest, I actually like the photos and I'd like to be able to use them, but I'm not too sure, given that that was actually paid for by council, whether or not I could actually use those photographs in any sort of election material that I would be putting out.
I'm seeing lots of shaking of heads, Ross. I think the mood of the room is no. Tony, what do you say?
Yeah, definitely. I just think, Ross, I understand why, and it probably looked great in those pics, mate, but you can imagine, an opposing candidate could say, well, you've been advantaged. I had to go off and pay for my photos or rely on, my next door neighbour's dodgy photography skills. So,
that was certainly my thought as well, but I just wanted to clarify. And also, in case some of my fellow councillors have the same question, I thought I'd ask that one. That's great, thanks.
And I don't think it's just a question of payment. I think it is a perception of having an advantage through that use. I think that's important too.
Good point. Okay, Kathryn, next cab off the rank.
I'm just looking through. I think we've answered a few of the questions within the chat as we've gone along. So I guess perhaps, Chris, back over to you to just check in and make sure I haven't missed any question we haven't covered off.
Terrific. I'll let you have a look at that, and I'll come back to Sandra now, because Sandra wanted to come back to the issue of social media, as I understood it, and make some comments. Sandra?
Just a brief comment, and I suppose this could be a philosophical, personal statement in terms of the use of social media in coronavirus campaigning during this lockdown and pandemic. We know that it's a growing platform for people to get their ideas out, even more so at this stage. But the philosophical aspect I'll bring in is which side of the ledger are people going to fall on in terms of their campaign style? Positive, and we know that there's negative Nellies out there, but I think we need to be mindful of the state of our community in campaigning at the moment. And for those new candidates and even councillors standing for re-election, spruik your credentials as a strong leader. And this is my personal statement, is negative Nellies are not inspiring in communities at a time when we're going through a lot of stress. And that's just the point that I wanted to make. And I think that that's important for the times.
Does anyone want to add to that or make further comment before I move on? I think that's well noted. So I'm not sure if this is a question for Warwick, perhaps. Previous candidate statements. One of the participants is asking, can you look at previous candidate statements to get an idea of what a good statement looks like and what's worked well and what hasn't in the past?
Look, interesting question there, Chris. I haven't given any thought to that particularly. Candidate statements, really for the individual to determine what do they want to achieve in their time in council. And you know, and Sandra may have a view on this as well, having been the author, no doubt, of a number of candidate statements. And I think in that regard, you know, be positive about what you're going to write. What are you going to achieve in your term of office? What contribution can you make to your local community? And I mean, I will administer the 300-word rule. I will look for defamatory statements, etc. And that's as much as I will do. But it might be worth Sandra, you know, providing some comment on how she develops her candidate statement, how she presents that with the ballot material.
With a lot of thought, if I know Sandra very well, and deep reflection. Sandra.
Well, I think it's probably true for every councillor who's in this room who's written one. I mean, you choose your words really wisely. You've got 300 words. I don't have to use 300 words. I mean, you know, you can probably say sometimes less is more, but it's there is no formula, but when you look at them all on the ballot paper, they can all sound very much the same. So, you know, it is good to look at some past examples. Councillors have probably kept examples and probably would be willing to share with candidates. And I'm sure every councillor here would be available should they be contacted by new candidates to offer advice. So it's not an exact science.
Thanks, Sandra. And a couple of questions about the 300 words. I think that's a change, isn't it? It wasn't 300 words before, it's increased. Am I right? Yes, I'm seeing some words. Yes, Warwick? 200
words.
Right.
That's correct. It is 300. It is now 300 words, which in the circumstances where we find ourselves is quite appropriate as well.
Okay. Another thing there, Chris, is just, I mean, there's some great information the VEC puts out that candidates really should read carefully about how, you know, what's allowed in those candidate statements. Every year I see statements where people have clearly attempted to put in punctuation and capitalisation and italics and these sort of things that may or may not be allowed, and it can change, you know, the impact on intended impact. So read really carefully the candidate handbook. The VEC produced a really good not style guide, but it's basically telling you what's not allowed. And clearly people don't read that every year because you see the outcome in a statement that's so beautifully crafted, and then when it's published it looks quite poor because they've tried to include types of grammar and abbreviations they're not allowed.
I just saw flashing up then, what about preferences in candidate statements? Indication of?
well, you can't make a reference to another candidate without their written authorisation. That's the starting point there.
Right. That's pretty clear. Kathryn, have we got any more questions? I noticed there's a lot of chat room activity happening, which is terrific.
There was a question from Councillor Lamb around when can candidates start campaigning. We did touch on that earlier on, Councillor Lamb, and I know you were a little late coming into the session. There are campaigning guidelines available on the LGV website. They're currently also being reviewed against the stage 4 restrictions, but I guess the answer is now, anytime, and Sandra certainly mentioned that also. So there's no reason why you can't start campaigning. You just need to be mindful that the campaigning activities that you might be considering do reflect what is permissible in the current environment.
Okay, so I think we might be approaching the end of the discussion. I'm wondering whether it is worth, because quite a few people joined us after the start, worth just revisiting that issue around this uncertain environment with changing restrictions, updating of guidelines, etc. Perhaps between Kathryn and Warwick, how should people make sure they're going to be up to date on what the latest information is?
Look, Chris, yeah, as I said very early on, that look, we're monitoring continuously. We're adjusting our plans continuously. We'll keep people informed. We've got a very strong election plan. We'll be launching a COVID safe election overlay, and I'm hopeful that that'll be out by the end of the week. We've had to adjust it, as you can imagine. The website as well. There'll be information there as well. The candidate handbook is there also. And given the local arrangements for the election as well, the election manager will be communicating with candidates in that process as well. So, and alerting them to local adjustments around the way things are operating.
Terrific, thank you. I think that's worth reiterating. Kathryn?
And certainly from the VLGA's perspective, please keep an eye out for our social media feeds. We're providing regular updates on election conditions on those feeds. We're also conducting candidate information sessions throughout Victoria. All of those are up on our website if you'd like to join in on any of those. And between Chris Eddy and Steve Cooper, who facilitate those, they're also bringing in the current information as we receive it. The VLGA is in consultation with Local Government Victoria on a regular basis. So we will certainly be keeping our members informed along the way.
Worth mentioning too, I think, Kathryn, that those sessions, while they might be happening for a particular council area, you don't have to be from that area to participate. So you can, the information's the same for all, so you can join in any of those sessions. Quick recap on mandatory training. I believe we've had some information during the course of the session that it should be there imminently, Kathryn, on the LGV site?
Yes, that's certainly been the advice we've received from Local Government Victoria. Deborah has kindly shared the link to the Local Government Victoria web page where that candidate training will be available once it is released. So keep an eye on that. And as I think you mentioned, Chris, councils will also then have that up on their respective websites once it's been released.
Yes, I think the Act actually requires them to make sure that they assist in sharing that information. So thank you, Kathryn. I would like to now just go around each of the panel members for some closing comments. And we haven't heard from John for a while. So John Lynch at the Inspectorate, thank you for being part of this. Any parting message on how you're hoping the next few months will go, John, from an Inspectorate view?
Well, I guess in an ideal world, we won't get any complaints, but I suspect that won't be the case. Look, as I said earlier, just make sure you know your way around the Act, know what your obligations are, and hopefully we'll avoid the 400 or so complaints that we got in 2016.
Yes, that would be nice to think that that might be possible. Thank you very much, John, and we really appreciate your insights today. Tony Raunic from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers.
Yeah,
I think we've put you through your paces today. Thank you.
No problems. And look, I hope John's right, but I think you're ambitious, John, but in terms of not getting so many complaints. But I think social media is really going to be a key issue this election. And remember, that's not just the councillors' social media accounts, it's the council's accounts. So governance officers, there's an ability for people to make comments often on your Twitter feeds and your Facebook accounts. Think about, you can employ filters. You could potentially get the names of all the candidates for council in your municipality and feed that into your filter as a word that is, not capable of being published, but certainly you want to be making sure that your council official social media isn't somehow, used as a campaigning tool by people out there. But I think that we'll see a lot of complaints on that social media front this time around, and it's one to be, extra careful with candidates and council officers.
Might be worth, and it might be just what Kathryn was posting, doing a session around social media considerations in particular in the next few weeks. Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate that. Sandra Wilson, Deputy Mayor of Hobsons Bay, thank you very much for sharing some insights with us, and all the very best to you.
You want a final comment?
Absolutely, if you have one.
I
Yes.
have one. It's just use your time wisely now, because there are limited times in every day when we can actually get out and do things. So plan very carefully and make the most of it. Photographs, bank checks, all of these things, organising, printing, and around social media, a team, I think, around you especially, that is watching and giving you moral support, because it can be brutal.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you. All the best. It's just occurred to me we had no questions about donations and campaign financing, which is a bit of a surprise. So that's perhaps another topic for another day too. Warwick Gately, Electoral Commissioner, thank you for your time. Any closing thoughts?
Look, thanks, Chris. The closer roll occurs on the 28th of August, not far away. If you're nominating, make sure you're qualified to nominate and not disqualified from nominating. That causes a lot of grief at the last minute. I'd ask people to be patient, candidates as well, councillors as well, electors as well. My casual workforce of 6,000 in 76 locations will require the community to have some understanding of the enormity of this if we're to be successful. So thank you, Chris.
And a stat that stayed with me from chatting with Liz Williams a few weeks ago, Warwick, is that you're not actually running 79 elections. You're running, well, 77 elections. You're running something like 300 when you think about all the different wards, which is a pretty staggering number.
It is. And look, I've been in communication with the CEO at Australia Post. I've got their assurance that things are under control in relation to that, so that's comforting. But it is a significant logistics activity in a very difficult, constrained circumstance. So bear with me. Thanks, Chris.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Warwick. If I could ask if you're able, the panellists, to hang back for a bit of the debrief after the session and the VLGA personnel. Final words from you, Kathryn Arndy.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to our panellists today. Look, I thought the comments that Warwick just made, and also Sandra earlier, around running the respect, I think, and recognising that this is a particularly difficult and challenging time for all of us. From the VLGA's perspective, we are here as an independent governance organisation to really support good governance, and negative campaigns, certainly in our experience, and in times like this when the community are already reeling, are just not particularly helpful. And I would also encourage candidates and even councillors to just understand that all agencies are working as best they can in these circumstances, and at the same time councils are at the forefront of delivering critical services to the community. So we can't underestimate the importance of the role of local government, the significant responsibilities that come with being a councillor. And I guess for those of you who are intending on running, I wish you the very best with your campaign.
Well said. Thank you, Kathryn. So for the information of everyone, this session has been recorded and there will be a produced version of it available on the VLGA's YouTube channel via VLGA Connect. If you haven't checked out the episodes we've been producing over the past few months, there's 85, I think, there now, which you can go back and pick up on, I think, a lot of interesting information about the sector and the public sector more broadly. So thank you again to every member of our panel. It's been a terrific discussion, and to every member of our audience for being with us and for participating. And we hope to see you in another session very soon. All the best and goodbye.